Chapter 1. The shadow over the valley. The land of Sodom and Gomorrah lay below, gleaming under the hot sun like a precious jewel, an emerald lost amidst the dust of the boundless, scorched desert. This was the valley of Sodom, bathed by the waters of the Jordan, which carried its life-giving moisture from the northern mountains, transforming the region into an oasis worthy of the Garden of Eden. The incredible fertility of this place seemed to be a challenge to nature itself, but in truth, it was a generous, undeserved gift from the Creator. Rivers nourished it, bearing not just water, but vital gold, coloring the fields in all shades of green and gold. The fields bore fruit abundantly. The grain heads bent under their own weight, and the people did not even know the meaning of hunger. Vineyards, densely clinging to the hills, stretched to the very horizon, promising endless delight in the juice of life. It was an idyll that breathed abundance, an eternal spring where every day was a feast and every evening a celebration. But this beauty, magnificent and undeniable, was only the external wrapping, a fragile shell beneath which a deep, mortal sickness of the spirit nested. Inside, in the hidden recesses of the human soul, a darkness settled, corroding the city like a slow, invisible poison that turns living flesh into dust. The inhabitants of these flourishing cities, intoxicated by luxury and ease of existence, forgot the heaven that had given them this gift. They began to believe that the land's fertility was their personal merit, and wealth was their inalienable right, granted not by God, but by their own efforts. From this frantic self-absorption was born their pride, which reached the heavens, higher than the towers of their most magnificent palaces. It was a blind, cruel, cold pride that separated them from the rest of humanity with a wall of pure egoism. They scorned travelers who carried only the dust of foreign roads. They turned away from the poor and the oppressed, considering their need a punishment for their weakness, not a cause for mercy. Cruelty became their daily bread, a refined entertainment. They laughed at those who sought justice and trampled upon every law of compassion. Any attempt to lend a hand or utter a word of sympathy provoked only derisive laughter, as they believed that in this world only the strong survived, and the weak were only worthy of oblivion. Debauchery and indifference became not merely sins, but the highest philosophy of life, elevated to the rank of a social norm, an almost sacred daily ritual. The city of Sodom was a laughingstock of truth. Any hint of moral restraint or spiritual law elicited blatant contempt. They worshipped not gods or idols, but themselves, their desires, and their uncontrollable, insatiable flesh. It was a kingdom of narcissism, where the echo of their own voice was the only sound they wished to hear, and the fulfillment of their whims was the sole purpose. Days passed in an endless, frantic banquet, in a dizzying dance of pleasure that had only one goal: to drown out the thin, yet persistent whisper of conscience, to forget that they were mortal. But the universe has its laws, and the divine will, quiet, irreversible, but filled with absolute justice, began to unfold. And then the sky darkened, not from clouds, not from a sandstorm or a natural phenomenon, but from the relentless shadow of judgment descending from the ether. The measure of sins, weighed on the invisible but precise scales of the Almighty, was overflowing. The cry of iniquity and violence, the whisper of debauchery, and the moans of the innocent reached the very throne, piercing the celestial firmament. It was not just a sound, it was the resonance of a moral collapse. And God, in his boundless justice and desire to be certain, for he is not a God of haste, descended to look. This visit was an act of final verification. Was there even a grain of hope left? Had the great cry of injustice truly reached him? The conversation with Abraham beneath the oaks of Mamre was not a dialogue of doubt, but a dramatic pause in time where mercy struggled with truth. Abraham, the great intercessor, pleaded for 10 righteous men, and the Lord, with his incredible patience, would have agreed. But 10 were not found. Only Lot remained. And so, among the 3 celestial men who visited the righteous man, 2, reflecting the heavenly will, set off downward into the valley. They trod the soil of Sodom, carrying within them the invisible flame appointed for purification, though they still had to try to save the only one whose heart had not yet hardened. Their path was one of no return, a path destined to prove. When mercy is rejected by an entire people, only the truth remains, which must restore order to the cosmos. In this shadow that descended upon the valley, there was no hatred, only tragic necessity. Chapter 2. Guests at the Gates of Sodom. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, bathing the sky over the valley in a blood orange and violet light, Lot sat by the city gates. This was his place, not a place of pride or power, but a place of observation, a place of solitary anguish. The city gates were always the pulse of Sodom, a place of trade, judgment, and, most often, a place of mocking noise and moral chaos. Lot's heart was heavy, burdened like a stone cast into thick mud. In the air, saturated with the scent of expensive perfumes, wine, and hardened sin, hung the sense of impending disaster that loomed over the city like a sulfurous smog. This disaster, this inevitable judgment, was felt by no one but Lot. The rest of the inhabitants were too drunk on luxury to notice the shadows lengthening. His gaze wandered down the road, and at that moment, he saw them. 2 travelers approaching the gates carried an otherworldly aura. They were unlike any merchant or vagrant who entered Sodom. Their clothes were simple but clean, and their gait was calm and measured. But what was most striking was their gaze. It was not merely calm, but profound, as if they saw through all things human, through the glitter of gold and the filth of lust, straight into the petrified soul of the city. There was neither judgment nor surprise in it, only an irreversible, absolute knowledge. Lot, for the first time in a long time, felt not fear of the city, but a sacred awe before heaven. "Please, my lords, come into my house," Lot pleaded, almost in despair, feeling that if these 2 spent the night in the square, it would be the final provocation. His voice was that of a man trying to postpone the inevitable, if only for one night. "Wash your feet, rest this night, share my humble food." But they replied, their words ringing with metallic, cold certainty. "No, we will spend the night in the square. We must see the face of this city, feel its breath." Lot, knowing the ways of Sodom, its perverted hospitality, its terrible thirst for new victims, insisted, begged, almost grabbing their hands. Finally, succumbing to his sincere, desperate persistence, they entered. In Lot's house, amidst his frightened family, an unusual silence reigned, like a sanctuary in the middle of a storm. Lot prepared them unleavened bread, understanding that he was sharing a meal with someone far grander than mere travelers. But the night brought no peace. As soon as the city lights began to dim, people gathered from all over the city to Lot's house. It was not just a crowd, but a tide of darkness materialized. They were old and young, respected citizens, and the lowest scoundrels, united by a single, base, debauched obsession. Their eyes burned with an unhealthy predatory fire, and their collective, low hum, reminiscent of the roaring of a hungry beast, enveloped Lot's house. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" A demanding, cruel shout rang out from the mob, full of arrogance and impunity. "Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Lot went out. He stood before them like a fragile barrier against a sea storm, his heart squeezed by shame, terror, and helpless rage. He stood on the threshold to protect his guests and pleaded, trembling, "No, my brothers, do not commit this evil. I know the sin you wish to commit, and it is a great abomination before heaven and before man." But the crowd, drunk on their boundless power, only sneered, "Who are you, a newcomer, to judge us? Now we will do worse to you than to them." At that critical, fatal moment, as the hands of the mob were already reaching for Lot to drag him from the threshold, the unthinkable happened. The angels, who had been sitting in silence, stretched out their hands through the doorway, seized him, and with a swift, careful motion, pulled him into the house. The door slammed shut with a crash, cutting the light from the darkness. And instantly, at that very moment, an invisible, devastating force emanated from the house, not touching the walls, but striking directly into the pupils of the crowd. They were struck with blindness. The cries of cruel demand turned into shouts of horror, chaos, and helpless despair. The darkness that reigned in the hearts of Sodom now fell upon their eyes as well. They searched for the door, groped for the walls, stumbling and hitting one another. For the city had lost not only its sight, but its last remnant of conscience. The angels merely watched as the mob, terrified by its own unexpected impotence, was finally forced to retreat, leaving behind the deep, tragic shadows of its moral defeat on the threshold of Lot's house. This night was the final test, and Sodom failed it with a dreadful crash. Chapter 3. The Night of the Escape. The chaos outside subsided, but inside Lot's house, the chaos of the soul reigned. The angels stood before him, their faces illuminated by a soft, unearthly light that contrasted with the gloom they had brought to the city. Their voice, calm but utterly irreversible, rang out like a verdict that allowed no appeal. "Take your kin and leave. We will destroy this place. Its cry is great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." The celestial pendulum had swung. The time for mercy was over. The words, "we will destroy," entered Lot's mind, but his heart was slow to accept them. Lot hesitated. This hesitation was not a sign of disobedience, but the deep, tragic struggle of a man whose roots had grown too long in the soil of sin, though he did not partake in it. His heart yearned for his house, for the possessions he had accumulated over decades. The silver, the fabrics, the status he had barely won in that cruel city. The memory of the past, of years of relative security and comfort, clung to him with steel pincers. He went to his sons-in-law, the husbands of his daughters, but his words, filled with mortal anxiety, sounded to them like a meaningless jest. They could not believe that their palaces, their unrestrained wealth, could turn to ashes in a moment. Dawn was close, and the heavenly messengers could wait no longer. Their patience, as great as their mission, was now exhausted. The angels did not plead. they acted with absolute authority. They grabbed him by the hand, and his wife by the hand, and his 2 daughters by the hands, and led them out. It was an act of involuntary salvation, rescue snatched from the clutches of death, where a person is forced to flee their doom. "Do not look behind you, and do not stop in the valley," came the final command, which became the mantra of salvation and an eternal warning. "Flee to the mountains, flee to the small town of Zoar, lest you perish." And Lot's flight began in the darkness, in the pre-dawn gloom, where every breath seemed like a cry, and every sound from the waking Sodom a threat. They ran through the valley, seized by panic, feeling the earth tremble beneath their feet and the air growing thick and heavy with the inevitable. Lot did not look forward. He only felt the angel's hand pulling him towards safety. His daughters ran behind him with tears and terrified screams. But his wife, Edith, could not tear her soul away from what she was leaving behind. She heard the roar growing behind them, felt the first, still weak flashes of fire, and then the sharp, acrid smell of sulfur carried by the wind. Her heart tore in two, between the fear for the future and the irresistible longing for what was lost. Her soul was tied to the luxury, the gold, the comfort of Sodom. She could not believe that everything they had acquired could vanish in a single moment. And in that same fateful, pivotal moment, unable to resist this devastating nostalgia, she turned back. It was only a fleeting, impulsive turn of the head, a look over the shoulder, but it became an act of disobedience, a choice of the heart that preferred transient wealth over eternal salvation. And at that instant, which split time, she froze. Not from human power, but from the sudden, icy breath of divine judgment. Her body transformed into a pillar of salt, an eternal, silent, tragic witness to what happens when the heart looks back, to sin, to material slavery. She stood there, on the border between the valley and the mountains, between life and death, between 2 worlds. Lot, hearing the cry of his daughters, had no time to look back. He only felt the hand running beside him disappear, and that sensation was more terrible than any fire. Lot's wife's pillar of salt remained standing, a proof carved in stone. You can lead a person out of the city of sin, but it is very difficult to lead sin out of their heart. They ran on, with this bitter, terrifying new shadow of loss behind them. Chapter 4. A new beginning in the mountains. Lot and his daughter's flight ended not in Zoar, as commanded, but higher, in the harsh, rocky mountains, where nature itself breathed an ancient, unshakable severity. Lot and his daughters settled in a cave. This cave became their new home, their refuge, but also their prison. The silence of the mountains, monumental and profound, embraced them but brought no peace. It only amplified the ringing in their ears from the cries of burned Sodom and the sharpness of their loss. They lived looking down from the heights at the endless sulfurous smog that billowed in the valley. But after the fire, not only the ruins of material palaces remain, but also shadows in the soul, shadows of loss, guilt, and unbearable loneliness. Lot, gray and gaunt, constantly looked back in his thoughts, recalling the face of his wife who had turned back. His heart was broken not only by the judgment, but by the fact that he could not save the closest person from her own choice. The daughters, widowed and cut off from the world, lived in constant fear. The silence of the cave was terrifying. It contrasted sharply with the noise and music of the luxurious but sinful life to which they were accustomed. They feared the future, feared being the last people on Earth, feared oblivion. Their trauma was twofold. They survived hell on Earth and were forced to see their mother turn into a silent statue of longing. They looked at Lot, the only man in their new, fragile world, and saw his helplessness and sorrow. Life continued even after the judgment. But at what cost? They were saved, but they felt cursed. The cave was a place of survival, not of rebirth. And only the wind, whistling through the stones, penetrating the stony silence, reminded them of this irreversible fact. The wind was the voice of the desert, the voice of time that stops for neither tragedy nor sin. It seemed to whisper, "You are free, but the price of freedom is the eternal memory of what remained below." Thus the cities of sin perished, and the earth remained, cleansed by pain, burned down to its foundation. But even in that tragedy, in that apocalyptic end of the world, there was hope. God does not destroy life merely to punish. His judgment always has an ultimate goal: to restore order, to show the absolute limit of sin, and to preserve that single seed of righteousness that still remained. Lot and his daughters were that seed, meant to give rise to a new, though sin-laden generation. Their story, carved in the pillar of salt and in the stones of the mountain cave, became an eternal lesson for all humanity. It is a story about how material abundance can lead to spiritual emptiness, about how pride destroys faster than any army. And everyone who reads this story, who stands on the boundary between the past and the future, between security and despair, hears a quiet yet commanding whisper that echoes through the centuries. Do not look back, for there is only ash, and ahead, the possibility of a new, clean path.